All right. Good evening, everybody. Thanks once again for joining us for Winter Nature Challenge 2022. My name is Brian Taylor, and I'm the educator with the North and South Rivers Watershed Association. And I'm joined here by Doug Lowry, our partner in crime. The Watershed once again partnered with Mass Audubon to offer this great virtual program. And so on behalf of both of our organizations, thank you so much for joining us. And we are really excited to have you for another fantastic presentation tonight. Just a special shout out to our sponsors, Clean Harbors, Lynch Marini, and the Mass Cultural Councils of Norwell, Duxbury, Hanover, Marshfield, and Scituate all gave their support once again for this program and continue to give support for other programs as well. So a big special thank you to them to support engagement in environmental education programs like this. So thanks so much. And again, thanks all of you for joining us. So without further ado, we've got a fantastic program tonight about salt marshes, something that is very special to us at the Watershed, and I know at Mass Audubon as well. And so I'm really excited to listen and to learn to tonight's presentation. Joining us tonight is Dr. Sara Grady, the Watershed Ecologist with the North and South Rivers Watershed Association and the South Shore Regional Coordinator for the MassBays National Estuary Partnership. And then we are also joined by Susan Adamowicz, the Salt Marsh Scientist at the Rachel Carson National Wildlife Refuge, among other places as well. So I will go ahead and introduce Sara to start. And Sara, I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen. You can take over and you can take it away. Once again, thanks so much for joining us, everyone.
Hello, everybody. So yes, I am Sara Grady. I'm the ecologist for the NSRWA. And many of you perhaps are familiar with my work. It's great to have two different presenters because we're each going to be presenting kind of a different perspective on things. I am going to be starting out just by kind of explaining some basic info about salt marshes and also the work that I've been doing locally around the North and South Rivers. So our salt marshes are extremely beneficial for lots of different reasons. They provide food and shelter for all sorts of animals. They provide storm protection. I like to say they're kind of like the bumpers on the land. They help filter, which protects us, protects water quality. And of course, they're also beautiful. And then they also have a lot of stressors that impact them. So the nutrients can weaken the peat. We also have had issues with green crabs that will burrow into the banks and cause slumping. On our river, we do have a no wake zone, but boat wakes can slowly erode at the edge of the marsh and accelerate bank erosion. And foot traffic on the marsh can also sometimes lead to trails and pans that can have difficulty recovering. One of the biggest stressors, though, that our marshes are facing these days is sea level rise and changes in hydrology. So when we look at a classic salt marsh, we have sort of this classic salt marsh zonation that we see. And as Sue will explain, this is extremely simplified, and there are a lot of things that are affecting this from the past and into the future. But generally, we have a low marsh, which is dominated by Spartina alterniflora, which is salt marsh cordgrass. Then a high marsh, which is dominated by Spartina patens, which is salt marsh hay. And finally, an upland, which transitions into often forested habitat. And you'll see at the edge of that, you'll see this particular bush called high tide bush, or Iva frutescens. So as we see shifts in vegetation due to sea level rise, we would expect to see the low marsh move up into the high marsh and replace it, and also start to see some loss of that upland border as the marsh is, if the marsh is able to migrate up into the uplands, then we may also see an extension of the high marsh. However, we may also start to see vegetation loss. both at the banks as well as in the high marsh, where the high marsh is exposed to too much water for too long, and that vegetation starts to die off. So the North and South, the North River in particular, is kind of unique because we have 13 miles of tidal extent. So we have tidal freshwater marsh at the headwaters. And so that means that we have salt marsh closer to the ocean. But as you get further upstream, if you've ever paddled up, past Route 3, you see that it transitions into a brackish marsh and a freshwater marsh. And that's beneficial, hopefully, for salt marsh migration along the river corridor. One of the things that we've tried to do is find out where that transition currently is and try to keep track of it going into the future. So we've mapped the edge vegetation along the North River corridor to try to find that transition and mark it. In addition, we have long-term transects that are actually a remnant of some of my undergraduate research, and that were surveyed in the 2000 and 2014. And we're already starting to see shifts due to sea level rise in our marshes. So out at Third Cliff, as of 2014, we had seen 81% of the high marsh replaced by low marsh, and 17% of the high marsh replaced by low marsh at the Driftway. And this just kind of is a quick comparison. So if you're looking at the colored bars, you can kind of see that the greenish bars would be high marsh and the blue bars would be low marsh. So we've seen at our 7 different sites, we've started to see sort of essentially loss of green and more blue. So less high marsh, more low marsh. Fortunately, we haven't seen too much pan formation, which is a problem south of the Cape, on Buzzards Bay and in Rhode Island, where the tidal range is much lower than we have here. Another thing that we have along the North and South rivers are a lot of docks. And about 5 years ago, I realized that these docks over the marsh provide an opportunity, because a dock is pretty much a permanent transect. So instead of a scientist going out and walking along a giant measuring tape from the upland down to the river's edge, we could just walk along the dock and make marks on the dock to try to help measure where those changes are occurring. So that is our Salt Marsh Sentinel program. And the way that that works is dock owners along the rivers have me come out and mark the transition between the low marsh and the high marsh and the upland, and also the location of any creeks or pans with push pins in the dock. And then each year they go out and see if that transition line has moved. And these are things that happen over the course of multiple years. So it's really a long-term study. But the sooner we're able to establish these baselines, the better we're able to perceive that change. So we have quite a few sentinels arranged throughout the North and the South rivers. 15 of our docks now have 3 years of data or more, and 6 have 5 years of data. So again, this is kind of how this might work. So go out, you have a red push pin marking upland and high marsh border, a blue push pin marking the high and low marsh border, and then we have a pin that marks the edge of the vegetation and the edge of the bank. And in the future, perhaps we don't have any bank loss, but maybe this high to low transition zone moves maybe 15 feet toward the upland, and then the high marsh is able to move a little further up, so maybe it moves like 5 feet. So that's the kind of measurements we're looking to take. Another thing that anybody living on the rivers can do, or even if you're not living on the river, but you can, you go for a paddle along the river, is keep your eyes out for ghost trees. So these are trees that are on upland trees that are now starting to die off because of either greater exposure to salt water or just greater exposure to water overall. Because with sea level rise, even if the trees aren't being exposed to salt water, they may be exposed to more water around their roots as that salt water is pushing the fresh water at the upland wetland interface a little further to the surface. So keep your eye out for that kind of sign as well. So this is just the beginning of the work that we are hoping to do going into the future. And Sue is going to be talking a little bit more about some of the restoration techniques that are currently being used in salt marshes. And we really hope to be able to implement some of those starting as soon as we can in the North and South Rivers and the other marshes along the South Shore.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm just going to share my screen here. You should have the slideshow view.
Yep, let's
okay.
right here, so yep.
All right, and just let me know if I can, is it forwarding? Okay, great, great,
Yep.
thanks. All right, so we'll just start back again. Thanks everybody for inviting me. My name is Susan Adamowicz. I'm a research scientist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm stationed at the Rachel Carson National Wildlife Refuge in Wells, Maine, where I do a lot of my work, but I also have regional responsibilities, and our region extends from Maine to Virginia. So it's pretty daunting, but I have some great colleagues stationed along the coast to help me out. My primary responsibility is salt marsh assessments, which we spent a number of years doing, and also primarily investigating and developing innovative salt marsh restoration techniques. And if we have time tonight, I'll talk a little bit about that. Sarah kind of set me up to talk about that, but really what I want to talk about is a little creature near and dear to our hearts. It's the salt marsh sparrow, sometimes referred to as SALS, S-A-L-S, in shorthand. And we're really concerned about these guys. They spend their whole life in salt marshes. They're endemic to the East Coast United States. They don't live anywhere else in the world. And they, as I said, they only live in our salt marshes on the East Coast. They build their nests just a little bit above the marsh surface, which is great when we have normal tides and no big storms. Excuse me. But when we do have big spring tides or storm tides, or even a lot of rain, you can see in the lower right-hand corner, you know, the poor little birds can get drowned out if they're not old enough to crawl out of their nest. And we see from the graph on the left, the number of birds is in brown, and that's been going down over time. And what's happening with sea level rise on the right-hand side is, you know, as sea level rises, these birds are at more and more risk. And we think there's going to be a critical juncture somewhere around 2030. And what we want to do is maintain a minimum goal of 25,000 birds across the East Coast as like a stable population. And what's hampering these birds? You know, we say the problem with the birds, the trouble with the birds is a problem in the marsh. And you might not recognize this feature in the middle of the slide here. This is a salt marsh embankment, and I'll show you more of those as time goes on. This is one is in Maine, but water can get trapped behind these. And saturate the soil and kill the vegetation. You don't need a lot of water to kill the vegetation. It's like overwatering a house plant. Happens all too easily in my house. And when the vegetation dies, the root zone collapses very rapidly. So immediately you can lose like 1 to 3 inches of elevation. And elevation is a very good proxy for drainage. And so, and in keeping pace with sea level rise, we want as much elevation as possible. And then here on the right-hand side, we have a slide from Parker River National Wildlife Refuge. I'm sure many of you have visited there. And there's an embankment between the two people in this slide marked by the yellow line, and it's holding water off to the side of the embankment. So right away, we've got 3 cases of embankments in Maine, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. We've actually found them in every salt marsh that we've been looking at. There's another effect of human alterations, and this is really prevalent in the north-south rivers, and that's grid ditching. And for whatever reason, the ditches were dug, whether it was for the farming or for for mosquito control. We know that the very deep ditches introduce oxygen low in the soil column, and so can start increasing the rate of the peat decomposition. And again, when that happens, we lose elevation. So elevation is really critical for these sparrows to be able to nest safely. We've got 2 ways where we're losing elevation. The first one is through waterlogging, or what we call the waterlogging subsidence trajectory. And this one with the over ditching and the deep ditches, we're calling the oxidative or oxygen subsidence trajectory. And we're really in a crucial time with no time to waste. If we do nothing, we are just going to continue to lose the percent of high marsh that exists out in the salt marshes. We can help the marshes to migrate, but that's only going to give us a little bit of extra room or a little bit of extra marsh acreage. We could do thin layer deposition, but that's really expensive and logistically complicated. So we wouldn't be able to get to all the acreages of all the salt marshes, or we could pursue something called adaptation resiliency, or correcting the marsh surface hydrology, where we could use a lot of very simple techniques to cover a large area, a lot of acres at very low cost. So that's something that we hope we can pursue. And 2030 is that vertical line right there. So we really don't have a lot of time to waste. And the SALs, or the salt marsh sparrow extinction, is modeled at somewhere around 2050. So time is of the essence here. And there's, as you've heard about sea level rise, no doubt, and that's this long-term gray trend. And if you go back to, say, the 1980s and kind of look at this, the line for this portion of the curve represents the more recent human-induced accelerated sea level rise. But there's this other pattern going on, this sort of wavy sine curve. It's called the metonic cycle. And we're coming into a low point of the metonic cycle shortly. And pretty soon we're going to be starting on this upswing to another high point in the metonic cycle. And when we start hitting that high point, the tidal range will be larger, we'll have higher high tides. And so restoration will be that much more difficult, not impossible, but more difficult and therefore more expensive. So again, we have to start thinking about taking action now. So just a brief overview of what we're going to talk about, a little bit of psychology and history, and then taking a landscape level approach to restoration, something called SMART teams. You may have grown up like I did with 4 basic tastes, but around 1985, a 5th sensation of taste was added called umami. And everybody talks about umami these days. And it's just amazing to believe that it wasn't an accepted taste or flavor in the West until 1985. The ancient Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu wrote a poem that says something like the 5 colors blind, the 5 tones deafen the ear, and the 5 flavors dull the taste. And what he was trying to say in that was that once you learn categories, you have a mental model in your head that sort of blinds you to other possibilities that are out there. And as it turns out, this is what has happened to most of us in salt marsh ecology from the time when we were baby scientists. We learned a mental model of the way salt marshes were supposed to and how they were supposed to behave. And so we were literally tripping over clues to let's sing. We're going to reveal some of this past and hopefully enlighten ourselves to what's really happening in the marshes. This is a painting from Martin Johnson Head, one of my favorite painters of all time, mostly because he loved salt marshes probably as much as I do. And when we think about farming history, we think about the salt hay farmers from the 17 or 1800s and these haystacks with their staddles. So these wooden supports you might have seen out in the salt marsh if you were lucky enough to walk around. He's got some cattle out here. You can, if you're careful, you can stack about 18 cattle in this little haystack here. So these haystacks were pretty darn sizable. And it's interesting also to see a fence. And here's what we think the farmers left behind, were just these saddles and maybe some ditches. But the actual farming history was much more intense. They created a series of these berms, what we're calling embankments. We call them embankments because that's what the farmers called them. This is a large reclamation embankment that would have been on the seaward side of a salt marsh. This is actually a repair of a dike, and they use this spelling. So if you're driving by, as you know, we have up here, any number of towns will have a dike road, D-I-K-E, and it's probably because that road was either built on a dike or it's adjacent to a dike, and the name just carried on through time. But this illustration shows actually some prisoners who were required to help repair this dike. It blew out right at the drainage channel. This water control structure is called a trunk because it looks like it's a big wooden box. You can see that they've cut turbs from the marsh surface, and they're protecting the outside of the embankment with these turbs. And let's see. This illustration just kind of blew my mind away because I knew that up in the maritime provinces, they had very large structures like this with large roads built on top of them. But I didn't realize that the pattern had carried so much into our marshes. So let's look at an aerial photograph from the 10th Street Marsh in Salisbury, Massachusetts. This is, again, close to Parker River National Wildlife Refuge. And we can see sort of a tidal channel in here. So in blue was probably close to the original tidal channel. And this tidal channel would have drained an area around it called the tide shed. So something represented by this dotted line. And a tide shed is pretty much just like a watershed, but it occurs in a marsh. But we also see a lot of these diagonal lines. These are ditches. And so the early colonial farmers did ditch their marshes, and they fractured or broke up that tide shed. So water was flowing in, different directions other than the way nature had intended. And so these are some traces from the 16 and 1700s. But later eras of salt marsh farming created these embankments. So these, these small berms that were just large enough to keep out the highest high tides, and they subdivided the marsh into hay beds, or farm fields. If we go to the Old Town Hill Reserve in Newbury, Mass, we can again see sort of this squiggly natural channel, and you can see some of the lines of the ditches. And it's just amazing that, going back to a 1938 aerial photo, we can see that there were over 200 farmers' ditches at this one site alone. So all these little green lines are ditches, as well as the blue lines. So that is pretty overwhelming itself. And then the early farming embankments were quite numerous. Now, this shows that in this particular area, there were 51 agricultural embankments at this site. And you would think, well, heaven to Betsy, why the heck were the farmers out there, even bothering with all these embankments? Why didn't they just, farm the fields in the upland? And well, they did. But what's a little deceiving is that this aerial image is more recent, and it shows a forested or a wooded hilltop. But this would have all been cleared by the 1800s. So the farming would have started right at the farmhouse, down the hillside to the marsh, all the way to the tidal channel, all the way to the ocean. And the salt marshes were incredibly important for providing salt hay for livestock food and for fodder. And because of these embankments, the farmers could freshen the different hay beds the closer you got to the upland. So while in the 1600s, they were growing salt hay down here with minor modification to the marshes, over time, over 200 years, they increased the modifications in order to freshen the hay beds so that they could start introducing crops that were tolerant of brackish conditions, like timothy, or it's also called herds grass or English hay, and some row crops along the upland edge that were also brackish tolerant. We like to talk about the famous Mangel wurzel, which is a kind of beet that was used also for livestock. So every scrap of an acre that you could get into this form of cultivation could yield you fourfold in harvest. And then as you increased the freshness, you also increased the value of what you were growing, not just the quantity. So what do these embankments look like today? Not very much is the answer. What we see here is a series of small salt marsh embankments in the middle of the marsh at this site at Old Town Hill. And you can see that there's one kind of grass growing on the embankment, and next door it looks lower in elevation because it is. It looks like the vegetation is stunted because it is. It looks a little wetter because it is. And these embankments are holding back water in ways that they weren't originally intended to. All right. During the 1800s, the farmers went from small scale embankments to much larger embankments called reclamation embankments. And in this site, you can see that there's a series. I'm just going to toggle back and forth here. You can see that there's a series, series of embankments here that are separating out the hay beds. These are the ones that would really be used to help freshen the hay bed and produce a more wide variety of row crops and that herds grass. Okay, and what do these reclamation embankments look like? Well, here's an easy one because there's a fence right on top of it, but often they're also flooded on the upstream side. So we've got these 5 reclamation embankments here and 3 salt marsh embankments. And how do we know what the heck we're talking about? Well, lo and behold, thanks to the age of the internet, you can just start Google searching for this stuff and come across old farmers' journals. This is a diagram that indicates how you can take a salt marsh cove or a small estuary and build a series of embankments on it, along with ditches. And these ditches are really important to maintain drainage. Here's another embankment. It's almost acting like a dam with much more freshening on this side of the cove. And here's a funky little thing. This bar represents a water control structure. That's the trunk that I mentioned before. Here it is. It looks like a box. It was made out of chestnut. Isn't that cool? And oak. And it had this nifty little vertical flap gate installed on it so that when the water rose, this little bobbin would close the hole in the top of the trunk. And this is actually a real place in Virginia. And you can compare this to the Google Earth image today, and you can see many of these features still remaining. So here's the 1800s footprint. Again, that illustration down in the bottom. Here's the trunk. Well, lo and behold, here's a trunk in Wells, Maine. It's now buried by the shifting sands, but we found it at a very low tide. And here's my colleague, Jeff Wilson. He's about as tall as Tom Brady. So he's a pretty tall guy. And you can see the remnants of an embankment just above his head on the far bank, which is really cool. It's growing black grass or Juncus giardia. And that's why it pops out as so bright green against the other Spartina alterniflora, Spartina patens on the adjacent areas. So some basic take-home messages is that the farming infrastructure is a system and it can be recognized everywhere in salt marshes along the Northeast coast. The system is a combination of embankments, ditches. I didn't talk a lot about ditches, but the ditches are equally as important as the embankments and these water control structures called trunks. The Works Progress Administration and other ditching was laid on top of this farming infrastructure. And that's why it's sometimes difficult to see and why we usually talk about just all this mosquito ditching. And yes, indeed, you know, you folks have a lot of mosquito ditching, but you also have a lot of other things going on in your marshes. And the current hydrologic failure that we're seeing in so many marshes is a result from the when these water control structures collapse, when the ditches start to fill in and clog on their own, they begin to hold water back. The embankments also help hold water back. And combined with sea level rise, it's resulted in a lot of this, what we're calling high marsh habitat, that lush Spartina alterniflora growth. Then, sorry, Spartina patens growth. So you want me to cut to the chase, eh? Well, Sara said, well, why don't you show us something from the North and South River so we can see what's going on here. And I started this little exercise the other day, and I will admit to you that the signals are difficult for me to see. I'm not an expert on this. And so what I did was start looking for a small cove, and I found it right here in this multicolored area. We'll take a deep dive there in a second. And I chose the cove because small coves tend to have very distinct and clear signatures, whereas, you know, the broad meadow marshes out here might not retain the signatures quite as long or quite as clearly, I should say. The signatures are still there. It's just that they're not quite as clear. And unfortunately, the sources I was able to access, I can only go back to aerial photos of 1960, which were quite helpful, but the aerial imagery that comes from the 1938 photos and along much of the Northeast, the imagery is just magnificent. And if we could get some of that for this watershed, we'd be sitting pretty. This is a 1935 topographic map from USGS. You can just Google historical well, I got this at historicalaerials.com, but you can also get it at, I Google historical maps USGS, and there's an ESRI or ESRI website that'll pop up that has a map viewer, and you can cruise around the whole United States and look at all of the USGS maps that they have for that area. So we're going to take a look in this cove right in here. And it's interesting to note that, you know, there's this New York, New Haven railroad line here, and that actually existed in the oldest topographic map I could find from the 1800s, the late 1800s. So this is a very old railroad indeed. And then there's a 2-track dirt road in 1935 that went out to this little island that has since, of course, been very well developed. So here we are. It is Bartlett's Island or Bartlett's Isle. The railroad is off to our left. And this is the little marsh that I want to take a peek at. There's a Google Earth image, and I like Google Earth because you can use that little timeline bar and just scroll among all the imagery that they have available to your heart's content. This little snowy image comes in handy from time to time. You can't take the absolute word of it, but it can give an indication of where the edge of the salt marsh is. Because if there was a high tide that came in, it would have melted much of the snow, except, you know, up in the upland area. So clearly this is upland as well, just doesn't have as much snow around it. So let's see. What I'd liked about this cove in terms of trying to look for these embankment signatures is usually across a cove, you can find a pretty clear embankment signature, something like this. And once I found that, I said, okay, I'm going to commit myself to working on this cove for a while. And I'll try to find, I don't know, I'm going to stop looking when I find 25 embankments. And you guys are like, what? 25 embankments? We see one, because I just pointed it out, right? One. And I will admit on this image, it's difficult to see the embankments, and you'll just have to take my word for it that I scrolled through all the imagery in Google Earth, and then on this other historicalaerials.com website. And based on my prior experience working in other marshes, I was able to pick up some signatures of other embankments. And the only other thing I'll say is never trust a map. This is what my master's professor told me, was never trust a map. You need to get yourself out there in the field. And so I've never visited this marsh before. Shame on me and shame on Sara for not getting me out there sooner, but I definitely will. And, you know, never trust anybody who just does an exercise on their computer. They really need to get out there and see the site for themselves. So you guys are going to find all kinds of trouble with the embankments that I'm identifying. And I'll agree with you that there probably are some problems, but that's only because I haven't had a chance to go out and really spend time with this site. All right, so here we go. The first kind of embankment I'm going to talk about is a form of terracing. So when we think of terraced agriculture, we think of rice paddies, right? Rice paddies. So think about terraced agriculture on a small scale, like inches. And if the farmer overtook, now again, this is over 200 years. So if a farmer over 200 years could squeeze a little more productivity out of their salt hay beds, well, wouldn't they do it? Well, absolutely, right? What farmer do you know that would just stand idly to the side and say, well, this is what the earth is giving me, so it's as good as it gets, right? So here are a number of terraced embankments. If we start here at the mouth of the cove, we've got that big embankment that I highlighted earlier. And then there are a series of embankments going across this cove. And again, you're just going to have to take my word for it. So this is one pattern. And again, when we look at the aerial imagery or we look at the site, we're looking at well over 200 years worth of history and farming alterations. So there'll be a series of patterns laid one on top of another. And it can feel like a jumble, but you just have to know that, you know, it's like we're looking at a GIS map with all the layers turned on, or we're looking through, you know, a series of transparencies where there are different images that make sense all by themselves, but when they're laid, you know, one on top of another, it can get pretty confusing. So here comes another series of terraces going in slightly different directions. So these are coming straight down the cove. These are coming at an angle, and I am sure, I can almost guarantee that there are going to be more along these angles. And yes, some of them will definitely parallel these ditches. Okay, so that's another series of embankments. And then a third kind of terracing sort of comes out from the Upland Edge. So a little more parallel to the Upland Edge. All right, now another pattern that we found is that you can start at the highest point in the salt marsh, and there'll be a series of embankments that radiate out from that. And again, you know, I'm kind of presuming that this is a high point. I would need to go and double check that. But there seemed to be a fairly clear radiating pattern. My colleague Jeff calls it a high top, like a tent, you know, like the circus tent high top, where all the veins of the tent are radiating out from that high point. And we've seen that on a number of sites. And this is some of the older signatures. So the terraced agriculture, you know, coming straight up the cove is relatively newer compared to some of this high top. And then the ones that are parallel, you know, close into the Upland Edge are either marginal embankments like this one or reclamation embankments across these coves as well. So the idea here was, again, freshening. And so that puts us in the reclamation area. And then what Jeff calls the teardrop embankments, so kind of come out in these arc forms from the edge of the upland. These he thinks are some of the oldest embankment signatures. So when you put them all together, it looks freaking amazing and very confusing. But what's important to recall is that there's not a lot of these embankments visibly left. However, if we scroll back, we can see that there's definitely an influence in the marsh surface hydrology in all these wet areas. The farmers never would have tolerated this. So their strategy would have been to help shed this water off the marsh through a series of drainage channels and embankments with water control structures. Again, because these things have collapsed, we now get this troublesome appearance to the marsh. Now that we can start identifying where this infrastructure is, we can start unraveling that Gordian knot of what the heck is going on with the hydrology, and more importantly, what parts of this infrastructure can we use to our advantage to get the marsh water levels correct again. So we don't want water being our kind of alternate flora. We want that water to shed, but not too deeply. So we can turn on and off portions of this infrastructure to our advantage. And we can do that through a couple of processes called ditch remediation and runneling and other techniques. But I see my time is a little short here. So what I want to do is just talk briefly about something called smart teams. And this is a way that we can start taking the notion of working on a restoration project from a local scale to a broad landscape scale. And smart teams, I was charged to come up with some sort of visionary idea to help us move from where we were in 2019 to So salt marshes and resiliency and adaptation. And before you know it, you start putting all those words together and you get SMART. So how could I, cast that aside? So SMART teams stands for Salt Marsh Adaptation and Resiliency Teams. And the vision is that we would start with local field teams, folks like the North and South River Watershed Alliance and Mass Audubon and other owners and managers. And those folks are the hub for where restoration activities take place. But I know from other experiences in Fish and Wildlife Service that you often need a big support team to help these local teams do their job. And so we came up with this SMART team idea where we would have the local field teams working on restoration projects supported by a design review team, a technical support team, where we're trying to fill in some of these areas of expertise, and then a training, outreach, and education team. Just so you can see what our progress is since 2019, we've got a number of strong field teams, or perhaps our strongest right now is the Great Marsh field team in northern Massachusetts, anchored by Parker River National Wildlife Refuge and Mass Audubon and trustees of reservations. We've got Southern Mass, Rhode Island, and New York City Parks field teams are really rather strong. And then a large number of developing field teams up and down the coast. And so it's really a lot of exciting work. A field team works, as I said, by developing restoration proposals, working together with a number of organizations in a geographic area that makes sense to them. These field teams form very organically. They, include a land manager and usually an NGO and often a researcher, and they can provide economies of scale. So together they can put together a portfolio for very large restoration projects, going for large grants that allow them to get a project coordinator, a single contractor for these portfolio projects, and even a single monitoring plan and monitoring team. The result is that we can get large cumulative improvements over the landscape sooner than we would have, if we had kept going at this 20-acre, 80-acre project size, piecemeal and slowly one by one. We can also rapidly share lessons learned through the design review team and the support team structure, the SMART team structure, and then go assist other field teams. So it's sort of like this is a hub, and SMART teams are the spokes of the wheel, and they go and they, or maybe the bicycle chain, and they go and assist another hub. I like the bicycle chain. I'll have to think about that again. So the design review team can help a field team develop and implement innovative techniques. In this project site on Old Town Hill from Jeff's design, the green ditches will be remediated. That's a process where you harvest salt hay and you heal the ditch by placing salt hay in the bottom of the ditch. That ends up filtering out sediments and can become a growing medium for plants. So you select very carefully which ditches you'll treat. And then, of course, you have to leave other ditches open to carry off the remainder of the water from the marsh. In some cases, we use runnels to connect these large pool areas to drainage. And then if we ever excavate material, we leave it on site in design mounds to revegetate on its own. You might not be able to pick it out, but this is a mound about 18 inches tall, and it's growing lush with Spartina patens, and that's exactly what the salt marsh sparrow wants to look for when it's nesting. So a higher place, lush vegetation where it can hide its nest. And because the SMART teams are a collaborative effort from Fish and Wildlife Service people, universities, state agencies, practitioners, mosquito control organizations, the Nature Conservancy, and others. Each member of the design review team has a different area of expertise. And so we not only cover a wide geography, but we also cover a large number of restoration techniques or technologies. And, amongst us, each individual has decades of experience with restoration projects. So we can help a field team, design and implement these projects. We have training and outreach opportunities. This is Dave Burdick and myself and Bonnie the dog, who's no longer with us, but we're teaching a class up at Eagle Hill in Steuben, Maine. This is Ellen Hartig. She's from the New York City Parks Department, and we taught this class a number of years ago, but lo and behold, Ellen helped spearhead the formation of the New York City Parks field team, and they successfully put in for a 1,000-acre proposal for about $1 million. So that was, that's pretty big news, and we'll be supporting the New York City Parks in the implementation of that project. This is my other Saltmarsh sister. Sarah Grady is one of my Saltmarsh sisters, but this is my other Saltmarsh sister, Wenley Ferguson from Save the Bay in Rhode Island. And this is Jeff Wilson again. And we're out with Steve Reinhardt in Rhode Island and one of his colleagues at Jacobs Point Marsh, and talking about their research on the Saltmarsh sparrow. And we are building our capacity to provide technical support. Our regional office is in the process of trying to contract with a hydrologist to provide assistance, early design assistance on like culvert projects. But I very much want to either have a grad student or a technician to help us delve into some of the history of these sites. At Old Town Hill, trustees had an ancient map of the farm there, and it just really laid out the whole farm for us, and we could peel back the modern layer of landscape expression to see what they were doing back in the 1800s, and it was just such a great piece of helpful information. And so what we want to do is be able to provide, site assessments, historical documentation, GIS mapping, and spatial analysis, along with monitoring data storage and archiving, and SDM and structured decision making. Everything's a science these days. So, but there are some really helpful ways to go through decision making processes so that everybody gets heard and you can really document why you've decided to go down certain pathways. And I think I'll wrap it up there. We may have a few minutes for questions, but I'll turn it back to Brian.
Thanks, Sue and Sarah. Holy cow, that was incredibly interesting on so many levels. If anyone here has joined us for last week, I talked about the Saltmarsh sparrow and how that bird is essential to the formation of the North and South Rivers Watershed Association. And then some of this, so if anyone does have a question, please put it in the chat. I have a question. So my understanding in the North and South Rivers with all the ditching that was created, I was told that a lot of this was back the CCC in the 30s, the Citizen Conservation Commission was doing like mosquito work, part of the New Deal, all that to get people out working. But that isn't the case. And I did not know that these ditches could go back prior. What percentage in some of our local waterways would it be either or?
No, it's a both and which is a complicating factor. So undoubtedly the mosquito ditching was laid on top of some of the farmers' ditches, right? But the mosquito ditching in many cases was wider and deeper than what the farmers did. And the farmers also, I was showing you embankments, which were pretty straight lines, but within each hay bed, there was often sort of they used the borrow ditches So they would dig a small ditch to excavate peat to form the embankment. And then once they had like the outline of their hay bed, they would then use these borrow ditches, which are sort of, square shape, to help drain that hay bed. So yeah, you really have to start peeling these layers back. And once you get the search image for finding, what an embankment looks like, you can't ever see the marsh in the same way again. So I'm really intrigued by your expansive meadow marshes. And I do want to go back and investigate them a bit more to start finding these signatures. And I might have to pull some of Jeff's time so that we can do that and just, start finding the pattern to them, because I know they're there.
It's incredible just going back so far and still being able to see signs of early history. It's just, that's incredible. Well, on behalf of the Watershed, we'd be happy to take you and your crew, have you accompany us out onto the river.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm there.
And Sarah would be there too, and Doug.
Oh yeah, can't go without me.
There are a couple questions coming in. So someone along the Green Harbor River, it looks like the salt water intrusion on the Daniel Webster Mass Audubon Sanctuary is killing the trees. Have you seen this?
So the Green Harbor River is kind of a complicated balance. So there's a tide gate, which actually is at Dyke Road in Marshfield. And that tide gate regulates how much salt water can come through. The populated area around that part of the Green Harbor River is pretty much at sea level. So it has to be very carefully controlled. That particular tide gate, the issue actually isn't so much the amount of water that comes in on the incoming tide, it's actually the ability of that system to drain. So it actually ends up with too much fresh water in the upper parts of the river. And so that's caused a lot of an increase in the acreage of Phragmites, which is another thing that, that I'm sure Sue could talk about for hours. But also it has impacted the red maple swamp as well.
Yeah, and Brian, I'm happy to speak to this too. So one of the things that, yes, the red maple swamp is now drowned. But you could imagine this situation being a model of what sea level rise is doing across our coast. It's not unlike what's going to happen as sea level rises, and as both Sarah and Susan addressed, these ghost forests are everywhere now, and it's often shows up in the red cedars that often are accompanying our coastal areas. And so there's places along the Green Harbor River, especially the Cut River Marsh, which is part of the Green Harbor Marsh system, where there's a couple of acres of red cedars that have died just in the last 10 years because of sea level rise and their roots essentially both being drowned in the higher water table level, but also the influx of salt water.
There's going to be a lot of work coming up with the town of Marshfield and some academic partners and Mass Audubon, as well as some other state and federal partners to try to understand what's going on there a little bit better.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, in the meantime, there's been a couple of communities built, yes, that would be inundated if we allowed the system to return to its original state.
It's really interesting. A comment, there's a couple things. A comment as someone from Al, as a former land surveyor, I have found that in some cases, the old ditches followed the property lines of various owners. Seems pretty interesting. Actually.
Yes, that's definitely true. And those ditches were usually a little bit wider. And I really want a history technician so that I can send them to a town hall to get some old deeds. Sometimes the property boundaries, switch as people takes what had been subdivided, small plots, and have aggregated them. And it's just fascinating. I mean, I've always liked history, but I swear you can take any discipline that you enjoy, whether it's art or music or history or chemistry, botany, wildlife, and you can find a parallel interest in the salt marsh. It expresses all of those.
Yeah. Another question from Gail. Is anything being done to deal with the damage caused by green crabs?
Well, the green crab issue is kind of interesting because as of, something like 5 to 7 years ago or so, there was green crab panic. And I think everyone was worried that all of a sudden something had happened to the green crabs to make them ornery and destructive. And they went through this surge where, there were videos from Maine, of just, you break off a piece of peat and hundreds of green crabs will come spilling out. I don't think that it has turned out to be as much of a panic as we thought. I mean, they are still there, but they've been around for, hundreds of years at this point. So we're not really doing anything. I mean, there's some efforts to look at uses for green crabs, a fishery for green crabs, edible purposes. But there's not a huge amount being done. I don't know if you want to say anything about that, Susan.
Yeah, in this particular episode that Sarah's referring to, the green crabs really decimated eelgrass beds down East Maine and in the Maritime provinces. And there's a lot of details beyond tonight's webinar that you can go just Google search. And because they think there's a more cold tolerant genotype up in the Maritime provinces. And certainly as we have warmer winters, the crabs will remain active longer. As the sea levels come up, the peat will be a little more soft, easier for the crabs to dig into. And so we are keeping a research eye on them, but it's really difficult to control a marine species. These are the European green crab. They've been here about 100 years, a bit more than 100 years. And people have tracked their progression up the coast. But it's just, really hard to control a species that reproduces by, such numerous eggs. And it's just really hard. So it's not like you can eradicate them. You have to be a little more subtle about it than that.
Is there any, a question from Scott, is there any marsh in the Northeast left untouched?
I used to think so, and people will show me marshes that have very few ditches, and what they're showing me are highly embanked salt marshes where the farmers' ditches are not visible today. So my answer to this is no. There are no, no marshes untouched by European influence.
A question from Amy, and this is a great question also. What can ordinary citizens do to help in the preservation and restoration of salt marshes?
Go for it,
I mean,
Sarah, then I'll chime in. Yeah.
all right. Well, my answer that I always give is that reducing the amount of nutrients that your own property is leaching into the salt marsh is probably the best thing that you can do at your house, because these larger scale hydrology concerns are made a lot worse by the fact that the peat is softening and weakening. We now know, just like when you fertilize any plant, it puts that energy into the above ground growth, and that weakens the below ground growth. And then there's also some more complicated bacterial and nutrient dynamics that occur in the peat that are causing it to sort of rot away.
Yeah, I would really echo that too. Just be mindful of the amount of fertilizer that you put out on your lawn. Don't sprinkle it on the driveway. It's not going to help the driveway to grow, and it'll just wash off into the waterways, which you don't want. And if you can create a little rain garden on your property so that the water that comes out of your gutters and off your driveway drains to a small garden that can actually use it. Rhododendrons and azaleas and other moisture loving plants can be a beautiful aspect of a rain garden. And rather than having that wash into the street and then down, a storm drain into a big patch of Phragmites, you can be a steward of your own stormwater and have that, help you on your own property. Maybe use one of those rain barrels on your downspout, store rain for the drought periods that we seem to be having more frequently during the summer. It's free water. Just think about all that rain is free water, and our landscape. So that, and then don't you dare ever, ever, ever put lawn clippings or brush piles on the edge of the salt marsh.
Yes.
I see that so much, and it not only kills the plants underneath it, but it encourages Phragmites to grow, other invasive plants as well, and it prevents marsh migration. So compost your leaves and your lawn clippings, and please don't put them in my salt marsh.
Another question from Susan. Do the restored marshes come back to productive life quickly?
Yes. That's the amazing thing. You guys remember from Jurassic Park, right? The famous line, life will find a way. And it does on a salt marsh too. So you see, even movie lovers can find something on a salt marsh. Yeah, we've used techniques in Rhode Island called runneling, where just months after the water is drained from the marsh surface, so not deep, these are very shallow channels. Once we get the water from ponding on the marsh surface, just a couple of months later, the vegetation will just spring right back. The longer a site's been impounded, the more elevation it's lost, the harder it is to bring back. But once we fix that surface marsh hydrology, the plants do respond very rapidly, at most in a couple of years' time. And that's what we want to do. We want the plants to not only produce, abundant above ground plant growth, but as Sarah alluded to, all that below ground, those roots and those rhizomes are what build the peat, and that's what builds the elevation and provides so much important coastal resiliency.
A question from Al. Are Phragmites killing salt marsh?
Mm-hmm.
No. We understand that, there's both a native genotype of Phragmites and an invasive form, and the stuff that's really tall and maintains the plumes over the winter, that's like 99%, you can be sure that's the invasive genotype. Phragmites is coming in because something has changed in the system that allows it to come in. So our job as restoration scientists is to figure out what are those stressors that are allowing this Phragmites to come in, and how can we, just push the envelope of those stressors to correct it so it favors the native vegetation.
There's also the somewhat controversial discoveries in the past decade or so that, you know, looking forward in terms of climate change, that Phragmites is actually excellent at storing carbon and maintaining structure, if not diversity in a marsh.
Susan, are there any areas where you see salt marsh sparrows populations increasing at all?
Yeah, I was just on a call this morning trying to identify some priority restoration sites in a couple of states. I wasn't working on this alone. I was just talking to a woman, Mo Carell, who's helping to lead that effort. And as far as the data show from a study that she's reviewed, the salt marsh sparrow populations are decreasing just about everywhere except Monomoy. Now, Nancy Powell, the refuge biologist at Parker River, has looked at a different subset of the data, and she thinks that the population is holding its own at Parker River or the Great Marsh as well. Unfortunately, we don't have years and years of data on these sparrows in, well, everywhere. We have them from a lot of different locations. The wildlife refuges have been really good about monitoring the sparrow populations periodically, but we just don't have data from everywhere every year.
Okay. It looks like that is it for the questions. Those are all fantastic questions. Unless anyone has anything else to add. A really special thank you to Susan and Sarah for joining us today. That was just absolutely fantastic. I am very interested in the history as well. And it's interesting when the ecology and the history can come together in a really interesting way. So thank you so much for that. It makes me want to just head out into the rivers as soon as possible and to take a deeper look. I'm sure you have found some pretty incredible things in the marshes from a century or two ago. Anything noteworthy that you actually would like to share that you found? Sarah, you can chime in too.
Well, we found that trunk, which, you know, it was so cool to see this water control structure in Maine was an exact replica of what was described in an 1820s document from Virginia. So it was like, it just really drove home the systematic approach to farming in salt marshes across the East Coast.
Sarah, anything noteworthy on your end?
There's always something interesting to find. I mean, a lot of my like weird history finds have actually been associated with dam removal sites and not so much salt marshes. But I did once find a very, very old bottle in the Green Harbor River, up in the creek, just kind of floating along, you know. This is pretty cool. And it was sealed, so who knows what's in there. It's in my office. Don't open it.
Yeah, just a fantastic. All right, well, that's fantastic questions. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks again to our sponsors. And Susan and Sarah, thank you so much for tonight. It was absolutely fantastic program. So I'll go ahead and close out the session. Thanks everyone for joining, and definitely thank you guys so much. It was a fantastic presentation. Join us all next week. Thank you. Join us next week for Reading the Winter Landscape by Doug and I. And have a great evening, everyone. And thank you for joining us. Have a good night.
Bye.